Welcome to Stop My Crisis. I'm your host, Vivian Gaspar, and here I am today to bring and shed light onto a very serious topic that affects everyone. Because believe it or not, it happens both ways. It can affect marriages, families, even dating people, starting from teenagers, and it knows no limits of age or socioeconomical class. Here in New Jersey, we're one of the wealthiest states in the entire country. And even with that status, we have one of the highest occurrences of domestic violence because even if you're wealthier or if you're not, it happens everywhere with any potential family or relationship. Here with me today, I have Carolyn Daly, and she is an attorney out of Morristown, and she's here to help us with the legal recourse that is available to us. Carolyn Daly is the principal of Daly & Associates, LLC in Morristown, New Jersey, a law firm dedicated to helping clients resolve their family matters with compassion and logistically easy maneuvers to guide them to safety. Thank you very much, Carolyn, for making it to our studios and educating our viewers on this critical topic.
Thank you, Vivian, for having me.
I need you to enlighten us. What are some of the horrifying statistics of domestic abuse?
Well, interestingly enough, one of the issues is people don't often feel that men can be victims of domestic violence, but in fact, 1 out of 4 women and 1 out of 7 men are actually victims of a significant physical attack by their domestic partner, either a spouse or a dating relationship. And that, I think, is something that most people don't know.
So when they say significant, do a lot of these cases have to end up in the hospital in order for an attorney to intervene or even the police? Or could it be something where someone walks to work, they have a black eye or a bruise? What qualifies as a real domestic violence relationship or situation? Because so many people just say, he or she won't do it again to me. It'll be okay. It was one bad moment.
It's very difficult, and it's a very good question. Domestic violence is actually one of a number of underlying crimes that in the state of New Jersey that are codified by statute to constitute domestic violence. In 1991, the legislature said, enough is enough, we need to address this. So the underlying crimes can be such as assault, terroristic threats, and harassment.
Terroristic threats?
Absolutely.
To your own boyfriend, girlfriend, or spouse?
Absolutely. So one of the parties can simply just say, I'm going to kill you. No one's ever going to find you. I'm going to take your children. I'm going to kill them. Those terroristic threats constitute an act of domestic violence. And it happens, again, not only with women, but with men. And I find that it's happening with younger and younger people, teenagers, college students. It's becoming more prevalent in that demographic.
Now, I started out by saying that even though New Jersey is one of the wealthiest states in the union, can this happen in wealthier areas, or is it really, as everyone else believes, in just the lower, more poverty-ridden areas? Tell me about that demographic issue.
Yes, absolutely. It can absolutely happen in wealthier cases and in wealthier families. The difficulty often is that wealthier families, men or women as victims, feel much more shame and are much more reluctant to make a report, in part because if you have someone who is a stay-at-home parent and the other parent is the one who's earning, the person who's a stay-at-home is afraid to get the aggressor in trouble for what has happened, whether it's an assault, whether it's terroristic threats, whether it's harassment, and verbal abuse is common and as one of the underlying factors of domestic violence, but people often discount it. I often hear from my clients, but he didn't hit me. At least she never hit me. That doesn't mean that it's not domestic violence. So even in those situations, people are often very afraid to come forward. There was an interesting study I found from an organization out of Tampa. They looked in Tampa, Florida. It's one of the few because there has not been a lot of study about whether foreclosure or wealthiness or those type of demographics leads or creates more of a potential for domestic violence to occur. And this study said we took the overlay of foreclosure complaints, actions in the Tampa area, and we laid that on top of the police calls for domestic incidents or domestic violence incidents or domestic problems. And there was a high coincidence between the two.
That's what I've often suspected. As you may know, I've been helping families resolve foreclosure issues for 8 years now. And so many times I've walked into a house and you could just feel the tension in the air, and you saw the interaction between the couples where you just knew that household was either wroth with it, they're going through it, something was abusive in the air. And I'm sure that directly relates with what you're saying.
Yes, and that's one of the issues, that when you have a financial stressor, and foreclosure certainly is, that will heighten, it's a factor that will heighten the potential for domestic violence. It doesn't cause domestic violence. Domestic violence is about control. It's about one person wanting control over the other. In about 27% of the cases, the victim, most often women, had no access to funds, no access to money.
That's what I was just going to ask you about. Isn't it more difficult because whether the woman or the man, whichever the victim is working, they could still have the control taken from them over even their own income by their spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend? Because I'm sure that the increase of women now making more money than ever before, I think that also has turned the tables.
Absolutely, and I've had cases that have involved women you would never have suspected would have been a victim of domestic violence. They are highly educated, have a good job, and yet the control you don't see from the outside. You only see when you have a conversation. Finances are often an issue, and it's when you ask those questions that not everybody asks as to what the basic dynamic in the family is that you begin to figure those things out. I had a client years ago whose husband, if you met her, you wouldn't know that this was any of an issue. But her husband would have her go to the grocery store.
Oh my God.
She would go shopping. She would then have to give the clerk the phone when it was rung up so that her husband could transfer the exact amount of money from the checking account into the debit account so that she could, or the savings account to the debit account, so that she could purchase those groceries. She had no other access to anything. No money, no credit cards, no charge accounts. She had no other way out. And that was the fear, that if she came forward and reported this, that she would have nothing. She'd be left out on the street. And a shocking statistic, or a shocking fact that I came to learn, is that domestic violence is the leading cause of homelessness in the United States. It is. And even more shocking is that there are 3 times as many animal shelters as there are domestic violence shelters, and that many shelters are forced to turn away people on an annual basis. One statistic I saw from an organization in New Jersey was about 400 people in the last 5 years.
So wait a second, does that mean rather than literally being on the streets, they many times would return to their abuser just to not be homeless?
Absolutely. And there's a whole psychology to that. I mean, there's a whole cycle of domestic violence with the aggressors and the victims, where the victims, either because of fear or shame, or because they feel they have no alternative, which is exactly what the aggressors are trying to accomplish.
Of course it is.
They return. And the aggressor is apologetic.
Oh, so
They buy flowers, they do all the right things for a period of time. And then what happens is they build up, it's called a build-up in the cycle, and they build up, and there's another explosion, but it repeats. I had a client years ago who was beaten very badly, and I obtained a restraining order for her and got good relief and put her in touch with some very good resources in the county where we were, and yet she walked into the courthouse a week later and dismissed the restraining order.
Oh my gosh. Speaking of restraining orders, is that a recourse that someone who finally musters up the courage that enough is enough? Tell me about the different type of restraining orders. What can someone do to protect themselves, and in many cases also their children? Because regardless if it's a man or a woman being the perpetrator, doesn't the violence carry and spill over to children many times?
Absolutely, and there are statistics that say there is a positive correlation between domestic abuse and child abuse, that those are often found in the same situations.
So they really need to protect their children as well as themselves.
Absolutely, and the other concern is there has become a movement to say that the victim of domestic violence, if she does nothing and she continues to return, that she herself can be prosecuted for a crime for failing to protect the children. That's on the forefront of discussions these days, which is obviously a very hotly debated issue.
Of course it is. I can understand both sides of that. I mean, on one hand, you want to agree, how could she keep putting her children back into that? But I'm sure such a level of domestic abuse is a psychology, rather, I meant to say, of manipulation, control to such a finite degree that they feel that they have no option. And maybe their own feeling of survival perhaps might even trump their children's well-being.
Absolutely.
So I can see where that could be an issue. Can you please tell us exactly how would temporary restraining order or final restraining, otherwise known as a TRO and FRO, how does this come into play to help people?
So if a victim finally gets enough courage to either call the police or seek a resource and meet with them, and after an instance of domestic violence, they either contact the police, which is typically after hours, which, by the way, is when most domestic violence incidents occur. They contact the police, they would report, they would come into the police station, they would talk to a judge, typically by phone, and the judge would hear what had occurred and either grant them or deny them a temporary restraining order. Temporary means that restraining order remains in place until they get to a hearing when a judge at the Superior Court level will determine whether or not they're entitled to a final restraining order after a hearing. That's often difficult for a victim when you tell them that not only have they now told the police what occurred, they now have to come to court and tell that story again in a courtroom full of people. But that's the only way they're going to get permanent relief. And New Jersey is different from other states. In New Jersey, a final restraining order, if granted, is permanent.
What do you mean by permanent? Now, I understand that's a forever thing, but what does it take to take it from temporary, and how long is temporary typically?
Temporary is typically a number of weeks.
Weeks, so it's quick to get a final.
Absolutely. And if once they go to a court and appear in front of a Superior Court judge and they retell their story with attorneys or without, but there are resources that will provide counsel for victims of domestic violence who qualify for free. And many people don't know that. And it's another reason why they're afraid.
Free is the key word.
Right.
That's how you get the help. Because of course, if their control has been taken from them by their abuser, they feel that they have no recourse. But if their resources, they're free, that all it takes for them to have the courage to do it.
Right. And that's, you get those resources, not as much when you report to the police station and municipal court, but typically when you get to the Superior Court, at least in the counties that I practice in, there are resource professionals there who will talk to the victims. And so the victims would be able to have counsel for free. They would go through a hearing, which is where they testify as to what occurs. They can be cross-examined, but if they prevail, there's substantial relief available to them that most people aren't aware of. Most people think that when you go to a hearing for a final restraining order, all you get is a final restraining order. But you can request custody of your children, often something that victims are concerned about. I get a final restraining order, but how do I protect my children?
Of course, it makes complete sense, and this is really important information, and I really urge everyone to reach out. And your consultations are free, right?
No, I actually charge for my consultations, but there are so many resources. That's really where I encourage people to start. Contact someone in the county that handles domestic violence and find a resource. There's a hotline for the state of New Jersey, and start there.
Well, it's good to know because you always hear so much conflicting information. So we will show different ways that this can be accomplished. So give me something, Carolyn, that explains a real life situation of violence being perpetrated in the cycle you're mentioning, and what happened.
So I can give you one that I consider my worst cases, and it's the one where my client, a week after getting the final restraining order and a substantial amount of assistance, went into court and dismissed the restraining order. The incident that occurred was her children were home, her husband was drunk, and although drinking doesn't cause domestic violence, it heightens the risk for it.
Of course.
He took a golf club and went after her and began beating her. And the only way it stopped was because, number one, there was a police officer living next door, and number two, their 13-year-old son stood between she and his father, who was swinging a golf club at her.
What type of damage did she sustain?
She had, fortunately for her, that intervention happened fairly quickly, but she was black and blue over much of her body. And when the police took photographs the day of the incident, you don't see that. When she appeared in my office, she was black and blue in arms, legs, which she could show me, her cheek. And so one of the other things is to take photographs. But remember, bruising doesn't appear immediately. So you have to know to continue to take those photographs because that's part of your case. And that's very important.
Can you give me a quick story to illustrate that often now men are victims as well as women. And that's the stereotype we need to break.
Yes, I can absolutely.
Physical violence.
Absolutely. I can give you both physical and non-physical violence. But an instance of physical violence, which was probably the one that really opened my eyes, was I had a client who was a gentleman. He was fairly large and tall, and his wife was relatively petite. But one night when she got particularly upset, she reached up onto a wall in their kitchen and took down a leather strap with sleigh bells on it and began to beat him with it. When we appeared in court, of course, everyone assumed, because she was petite and he was so large, that she was the victim of domestic violence, but it wasn't. And their adult children were there, and both sons who had been present and knew of the incident were infuriated that the assumption had been that their mother was the victim.
Thank you very much for giving us those illustrations, because it's not always a knife to the throat or the very classic things that unfortunately people use what you wouldn't even suspect as an object as a weapon of torture or abuse.
No, and quite often it's fists and hands and feet, not something outside your body like a golf club or a strap. Oftentimes it's literally just beating.
I'm sure that's many times the case. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
She ripped half my hair out of my head. She scratched up my face, punched me in the face and the head. She tore my ACL.
Do you face physical violence, harassment, or verbal threats at work? Employers are required by law to provide a workplace free from hazards like workplace violence.
Even on the street, I wouldn't expect to be assaulted like that. Certainly not at work.
For information, go to njwec.org or osha.gov. This message brought to you by the New Jersey Work Environment Council.
Welcome back to Stop My Crisis, and here with me today is Patty Singer. Patty is the owner of Follow Me Social Media Consulting. She works with small to mid-sized businesses managing their social media marketing. She also does consultations, teaches workshops and seminars, and is a social media expert on WR 710 radio for the program Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life. Thank you very much, Patty, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, you're doing a very different topic. We're not here to change businesses' lives right now.
No, we're not.
What is it, the very serious topic that we're tying into today, is something that unfortunately the people who need it the most don't realize its importance. With today's world of technology, I don't think it's easy to be invisible, especially when you need to be for survival. What do I mean by that? Unfortunately, the people who are in domestic violence relationships, who have tried so hard to get out and escape, once they're out, they're so happy, they just want to forget about their past. But if they're not careful, their past can come back, because unfortunately, a really large percentage of people who are murdered are usually murdered by someone they used to love. Patty, tell us, how can those people stay safe going forward to restart their lives?
Well, like you said today, technology plays a huge part in our lives. Right now, over half the world's population are internet users.
Half the
4
billion
population.
Or 5 billion
yes.
people? Oh my gosh.
And over 2.2 billion users are active on social media.
2.2 billion.
Yes, 2.2 billion. The scary statistic is that there are more people who own smartphones than toothbrushes.
Wow.
I know.
I'm sorry.
I
That
know.
is frightening to the core.
It is. It is.
We should all have whiter teeth and less cell phones and smartphones.
Exactly. So with technology, you have to be very, very careful as to what you're doing on the various social media platforms.
What is it that you mean by that? How could someone who's trying to be invisible to save themselves and perhaps their children that they're escaping with from a domestic violence relationship, what is the mistakes that they commonly do that can unfortunately lead their previous, assailant back to them?
Yeah, they can go on Facebook and they could be posting rants about their ex. That's only going to incite their anger and make them come after them even more. The best thing they can do is be really careful about what they're posting and where they're posting it. What I think they should do is do a Google search on themselves.
How does that help?
Well, they can find out where they're showing up, why they're showing up, and on what platforms, so they know where they need to really keep quiet or be careful about what they're posting out there. Another thing they can do is disable the location finder on their smartphone, because
that's a
your
good one.
smartphone is telling the world exactly where you are.
But aren't there some platforms of social media that some people use it to check in?
They
but when you
do.
check in,
They do.
unfortunately, that might lead to you permanently checking out.
Absolutely.
It's Foursquare, right?
There's Foursquare. You can check in on Facebook.
Oh,
you
my
know, there's a
God.
ton of the apps out there that you can check in on and say, you know, hey, I'm at this restaurant with my friends. It's just leading those people right to you.
And that makes you, unfortunately, stalker friendly.
Right. It makes you a target for sure.
And so when you take pictures with your friends and you end up doing that, let's face it, almost everyone does that, you can't help what your friends end up posting or tagging you in the pictures. Can someone do something about that to keep themselves safe?
They can try. You should let your friends know what your situation is so they can be mindful about posting pictures with you in them and tagging you and saying where you're at. You know, tell them what the situation is, and they're usually very receptive to protecting you since you are their friend. The next thing you can do, like within Facebook, is you can set a security feature in there that says, I don't want anything, I don't want myself tagged on anything or in any picture without my approval. So you can set that up so every time someone tries to tag you, you will have to approve that tag first.
Honestly, I had no idea.
Yes.
So we do have to end our time, but this is amazing information that I think that there's millions of people in this situation, unfortunately, that never realize this. Can you just give us one more quick takeaway, please?
I would say, you know, most of us are on Facebook. Most of us, that's where we connect with our friends and our family. If you've already blocked that person or unfriended them, I would say the next best step would be maybe to create a whole new profile.
That's a good idea.
Tell your trusted friends and family, ask them, please don't refriend the person you're trying to get away from, whether it's your ex or a stalker. So that way you can very much distance yourself from that person without a large chance of it leaking out to them.
That is extremely useful information. Thank you so much, Patty,
You're so
for
welcome.
coming to educate our viewers on this.
Thank you.